Hi. I just finished watching the second season of the sitcom AP Bio. So I thought I would just do a quick discussion of it, give my thoughts on it, in case anyone was wanting to watch the second season of a fairly obscure NBC sitcom. But whatever, I have some stuff I wanted to talk about. So what's up with this show? The premise is we have our main character who is a disgraced former Harvard philosophy professor who, as a result of many mishaps, is now stuck teaching advanced placement biology in Toledo, Ohio. And he absolutely hates it. He has no interest in teaching biology whatsoever, but he uses the resource of his class, of all these brainy students, to try to plot revenge against those that disgraced him and escape the confines of Toledo, Ohio. The expanded cast is like all the wacky teachers, the wacky principal, and the wackiest of all, the students themselves. You can probably kind of guess the sentimental journey of this show that eventually he comes to love Toledo, or he really embraces being a teacher and learns to appreciate all the quirks of his students. And to some extent that's true, but they really do manage to resist this kind of easy, sappy path with quite a few twists and such as the plot progresses. But only mostly. Slowly, it seems like they are kind of crumbling in that direction, and only really kind of like whenever there is just sort of a deviation away from the standard sitcom plot line, it's kind of like a half measure. So I don't know, especially after this season, I'm not quite sure how they're going to go with this. But I was impressed that they kept up kind of the facade of deviance for as long as they did, at least. So why I watched season one, mostly because of the cast. I'm a big fan of both Glenn Howerton, who's Dennis in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, who plays the main character, and Patton Oswalt, who's just a hilariously funny comedic actor who's been in all sorts of stuff. It was produced by Lorne Michaels, who I really like as a comedy producer. Most of the sitcoms he's been involved with, I've been a fan of. And also, it was an NBC sitcom. I generally find their sitcoms to be the best of like the big three American networks. Generally, they kind of push shows in the direction that I'm most interested in. They don't have the I don't know, like they don't seem as desperate, I guess I would say, generally when they're kind of pushing sitcoms. I was really worried that they'd go kind of too sappy with it. As I was saying before, the plot line just seems absolutely set up to be like, oh, but then the cynical professor man has a big change of heart and learns to love the charms of small town America. But this was nicely countered. As I said before, they even if it's just sort of playing lip service until they inevitably go in that direction, um, there's just kind of a stronger current of kind of weirdness, and I would say almost abrasiveness, that so many of the characters are so strange and initially unlikable, that you could imagine they would have had a much easier time had they done different things, you know. And in the end, that's really all you can kind of take uh, kind of refuge in or appreciate, is that if they wanted just to give us the most basic sappy version of this show, they could have made it a lot easier on themselves. So at least they're trying to kind of earn it, you know? I was also really worried that they'd go too easy on the kids. Generally speaking, I don't like family type sitcoms that involve children, things like that, because usually the kids aren't allowed to be the butt of the joke. I think just in general, most audiences don't like laughing at children. You know, they're supposed to be innocent. They're supposed to be, um, they don't know any better or whatever. So you can kind of have some lighthearted jokes at their expense, but in the end, they're always going to have like this happy moment of being understood and knowing that things are okay. But again, this was really, they leaned into the very opposite of this. That the kids aren't kind of reasonable, likable people, but are really super weird. They're likable, sure, but they've embraced the other side of this equation, that the child characters don't have to be full-fledged people. It's like perfectly reasonable and realistic for them to be totally weird and socially disjointed and not really full complex characters yet. And they really leaned into that the kids are just so bizarre. And I really appreciated that. And I really appreciated that they would just brutally make jokes at the kids' expense and attack them. And they really did have a clever setup for this because, of course, our main character, the Glenn Howerton character, is supposed to be like a mean guy. He's supposed to be an uncaring, um, very cynical, kind of bullying person. So it made perfect sense for him to be so adversarial with the student characters, and yet I found that like really funny too. Um, I don't know. I was pretty impressed with all things considered. I thought it was a pretty funny show. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the larger story arcs. I found myself invested in what was going to happen. I really liked the ending of it, especially. But the ratings and such weren't great, and apparently it only got this second season by the skin of its teeth. So I was very curious to see what they would do going into season 2. So season 2s of sitcoms are really huge when you think about them. You're basically doubling the number of episodes that the show has. So with that, you have the ability to really radically change the perception of the series as a whole. Like you have just as much time as all of the time of the series that has existed so far in order to make an impression on the viewer. So what do you do? Wait a minute. Did I put these in the wrong order? Oh, yeah. Wait. No. This makes sense. Yeah. So it's like you could radically change everything. You could just kind of 180 everything on the show and try to attract a new audience, which is something that we've seen in shows like Parks and Rec or The American Office, where they kind of started with one sort of more cynical type tone, and then by the end of the first season realized that they should pivot into a more wholesome, kind of accepting type of tone. So I really kind of braced myself for something like that on this show too, that they would get rid of these kind of more abrasive aspects, make it less cynical and dark and aggressive, and make all the characters kind of more likable and harmonious. But at the same time, you got to wonder, like, should you instead lean into what gave the audience that existed and enjoyed the first season? Should you just try to expand from that place outwards, making the show better and better for those people, such that they can, via word of mouth or reviews or whatever, spread it to people that also have that same sensibility? Do you go for pool B, or do you try to expand pool A? Or you can just kind of do all sorts of stuff. You can swing for the fences with kind of more masterpiece-esque experimental type episodes. And they did a little bit of that here. There was the one real-time episode that really messed with conventional sitcom structures and formulas that I was quite impressed by. And I thought maybe they would do a lot of that to try to get some attention again, more experiments and such. But for the most part, they didn't do a whole lot of this. Other challenges are like all of the big climaxes, all of the big moments of character revelation that you had in the previous season need to kind of have some sense of ramification. You can't just go back to the old formula. And that's difficult because you've really not had time to establish what these developments are changed in reference to, Like to have, I'm a character that's had a big change of heart. Now I'm a totally different person, but you barely knew the person they were before that change of heart. So this is inherently quite awkward, I think, and very difficult to pull off without kind of feeling like you're cheating, that you're devaluing the impact of those things, or again, you're switching up the formula too much and you're kind of losing out on things that might have made the original show likable. Same with like things that are like kind of joke relationships, like characters that interact in one way that's kind of one tone, one note jokes that just keep recurring. These sorts of things need to be fleshed out, or else now that you're a second season in, they kind of become cruel parodies of themselves, that it's still happening, that there's still this just kind of torturously one-note relationship or whatever. So you're really damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. That if you develop too much too early, then you're too quickly kind of discarding the things that people are initially latching onto when they decide to watch the show. But then if you don't have developments, if you don't have things that get fleshed out, then too quickly the show seems to be sort of trapped within itself. And the characters that are supposed to become enduring, which is what I meant to say, endearing and likable and all of this stuff, are kind of just trapped in these same tight cycles of one or two jokes. So it's tough. It's very tough. And I assume that lots of market research goes into this. Like, they're looking at each individual episode of season 1, how well it did, what sort of feedback they got. They probably have all sorts of focus groups and stuff. We don't have access to any of that data, so we're not able to just go like, oh, well, clearly this, and this were hits, so they amped them up, and this, and this weren't working, so they replaced it with this. But we can kind of speculate. Looking back at what did happen in season 2, we can kind of try to tease out what stuff must have been working before and what stuff they decided they needed to switch up. Okay, so let's get into that. Number 1, this is the thing that impressed me the most. The courage to make fun of a weird kid. Here I'm referring to, of course, Hachikuji's dubious but ultimately proved true statement that no matter what you say, as long as you put the courage to in front of it, it sounds like you're doing something actually very bold and meaningful. So I was really impressed that they leaned even further into the idea that the kids in the class are weird, that there should be like jokes at their expense, that they're not going to be completely fleshed out and motivated. And I thought that was probably one of the more abrasive aspects of the first season, that people don't like to see kids made fun of. And this I just sort of based on general sitcom trends. So I thought they were probably going to downplay that all of the kids, throughout the first season got a little bit more fleshed out, and that by the second season they would be like very sympathetic characters, somewhat untouchable in that regard. And I was really, I don't know, pessimistic about what that would feel like. But no, they just keep making fun of they just keep making fun of kids. Now, I noticed that they shuffled around the main kids a bit. There was a few that got written out of the show entirely, and a few that became much more minor characters than they were in the first season. And then there was a few new kids that were added as well, that either weren't there at all in the first season or had relatively minor roles. This was given no explanation whatsoever within the show. So I kind of think maybe it was just based on casting logistics, like some people didn't sign on for the second season. I don't know. But what it ended up resulting in is it got even weirder. Like, some of the kids that were more fleshed out and sympathetic and reasonable took a backseat or were taken out entirely and replaced with kids that once again were like very shockingly weird in some directions, which I thought was great. And more of the episodes in the first season, I very quickly saw like a formula where each episode would have like a main kid who would be instrumental to that week's scheme or plot or whatever. And at first, the kid would be screwing stuff up because of some internal personal trouble. Then Jack, our teacher, would kind of reach out to them. There would be like a sympathetic, heartwarming moment where they kind of connected. And then, next week we'd move on to another kid. And it was like, okay, that's fine. But more and more the plots seemed to be kind of shifting away, which was good because the seams of that structure, to me, started really becoming apparent by the end of the first season, where I could just sort of see the whole plot line coming just from the start, which is fine, but not really that exciting. And sometimes it felt a little cheap that these emotional moments by the end were quite unearned. And when they had the same sort of structures in this season, there was the same kind of feeling of it being forced. So I'm glad that in general they're moving away from this routine and more into ones where the class as a whole is more of an entity, and that there's these sequences where it's more of like a reaction chorus where something in the main plot line is happening, and then the kids, with their limited involvement, just sort of all contribute in sequence, some subset of them all making little quips or jokes or whatever. I think that's fine. I think that's a good way to really take advantage of the resources you've built up of all of these minor characters. Minor here being a pun, I suppose. And sometimes it's very, very funny. Sometimes it's a little cheap, and you can tell it's just kind of like an easy way. Like, okay, we can have like 2 or 3 jokes, just kind of here, with no consequence. We'll cut to this kid, he'll say this. We'll cut to this kid, she'll say this. Blah blah blah. And there, it's like, okay, but it can still be funny, right? Like the character writing in the show, I think, is very funny in general. So I'm okay with them leaning on that sort of easy formula. And I found that a lot of the kids' plot lines were kind of put on the back burner, which I thought was quite interesting. That a lot of relationships between them and their own kind of personal troubles and stuff, even if it never was the focus of an episode, you could see some development there, just kind of each time that it was briefly referenced or whatever. And I thought that was actually really cool. Like that to me starts to build up a feeling of like a living cast. That everyone in the show has lives outside of what's depicted, that they're like really people. And the mixture of this kind of completeness and continuousness with the fact that the kids are like so weird, and then it's reasonable for the life of a high school kid to be like kind of disjoint and strange, I think is like quite a nice combination. So I don't know if these plot lines are being saved for later, but if they are, this kind of leads into the next section. I just hope that they're not too sappy and sentimental about it. Because there was still some softening up on the show too. Even though they kind of took it stranger with some of these more abrasive aspects, you could tell that there was some compromise being made to kind of give people something more to attach to on this show. So, as I said before, you need to kind of flesh out some relationships that are more just one-note jokes. So here, the big example is between the principal, played by Patton Oswalt, and Jack, the main teacher. The principal is like basically obsessed with Jack, thinks he's like the coolest guy ever, just wants to be his friend, wants to hang out. Jack, in turn, thinks he's like way too cool for Principal Durbin, is always trying to find excuses to get out of things with him. And throughout, they have moments where he kind of softens and appreciates Durbin and helps him out, which were taken to greater extremes as this issue just kind of got more and more focused on. And I think this was generally well done. But I wonder, like, you can't walk back from these things. If you have these clear moments of sentimentality between the characters, then you can't, in the next episode, just have Jack start acting very cruel and disinterested towards Principal Durbin again. And it's like, that's fine, but it shifts what kind of jokes you can make. Like, you can't just rely on that sorts of setups anymore. So it's like, I don't know. I wonder what kind of conversations they have around this. Like, okay, what plot lines can we have that we need to do first, that we need to put before, the sentimentality, before the actual meaningful connection. This is kind of interesting to me. So what they did to kind of balance this out, which I think was quite clever, is by adding new characters, not just the students, but a few like one-off characters, a few other characters of the staff, bringing a few characters into slightly more prominence that are yet to be fleshed out, that don't have these sentimental moments yet, that are still very like one note and can be used just as like a living punchline. And I think this was done quite well, that the new characters felt very fresh and insane. But is this sustainable? Like now in season 3, if it happens, will they be fleshing out these new characters, giving them moments of compassion and empathy, and then they have to add even more characters? Like when does it end? Can you actually sustain a show by just continually growing the cast like this? The other thing they did to really, really soften up the show was add a substantial relationship plotline for Jack, for the main character. He meets this woman in payroll that he's completely enamored with. Many, many wacky situations later, they have quite a few moments of intimacy, moments of emotional vulnerability and stuff, and this, of course, ties back into the main plot line. Does he want to leave Toledo and go back to his old life? Is he becoming charmed by Toledo and he wants to stay? Blah, blah, blah. Not much of this really worked for me. I thought it felt like very flat, very unearned. Mostly just because the relationship interest, this woman, Lynette, is supposed to be one of the few kind of reasonable characters. You know, she's like not that wacky. She's usually kind of making the jokes at other people's expense, just like Jack. Usually she's kind of one up even on Jack, that when Jack is in whatever wacky situation, she's there to make fun of him a bit. And then like that in itself is a good dynamic. Like it's okay to have more characters like that. And I think her as a character was actually done quite well. Like I found her funny and interesting and fine. But the core of like why she's on the show to me was insanely unreasonable because she has no reason to like Jack. She has so many reasons to dislike him. So much of their relationship was just sort of through convenience, through the plot, just sort of making it happen in sometimes like extremely cheap, forced ways. And because of that, she feels like one of the most unreasonable, unrealistic characters of the show. That she just kind of is plopped down, and everything is ideal about her, and everything just kind of moves at the rate most convenient to the plot with her development. So I was like, really? I don't know. I think that was definitely a low point of the show for me. Plus, basically, the message here is like, you know, all of the weird stuff that he initially disliked about Toledo has remained weird or gotten even weirder. And I thought the idea that eventually he would come to see things that he liked about that would be kind of interesting. Whereas now it's more like, well, he still is maybe developing that. What really makes or breaks it is this woman who isn't weird, who doesn't really reflect the weirdness of Toledo, who is totally disjoint from his feelings about the city in general. You know what I'm saying? It's just like, meh. So just a few other things. For me, the best aspect was still the episodes that just devolved into absolute chaos. I think just in general, this is the sort of sitcom writing I like best, especially if there's good A and B plot collisions where just a huge comedy of errors causes everything to, you know, go to hell. I love it. I also really still like the character writing. I think there's such just a wide variety of jokes that can be made with this cast of characters, and so many of them felt shocking, just like kind of references they make, or I don't know. I was just really impressed with that kind of tight, small character writing. The season-wide arc was very downplayed from the first season. Whereas the first season, you know, was all about him getting revenge on the people that ousted him from Harvard, trying to get a job again, trying to get out of Toledo. Here it's more like, oh, I'm going to write this book, and when it gets published and I'm successful, I can leave. But it's not mentioned in like most of the episodes. It just kind of feels a little shoehorned. It pops up here and there to motivate something, but only a few episodes actually to address it. And I think that's like fine. But I don't know. They're trying to kind of have their cake and eat it too. That they know they need some sort of forward arc, like some sort of constant struggle in the mind of the MC. Does he want to stay? Does he want to go? So they need something, but then they didn't really want to commit too much to it. So I don't know. It was fine though. And this kind of comes to a head with the false dilemma at the end. I guess this is minor spoilers, but he basically in the end has the choice. Can I go to New York to talk about having my book published, or can I stay in Toledo and give up on the book? And I felt this was like an extremely lame false dilemma. Like, you're allowed to go to New York for a meeting and then come back and continue your life in Toledo. Like, it doesn't have to be an either or just snap decision. You don't know at all that that your girlfriend would disapprove of you, you know, having this book published and quitting teaching and then living wherever. Like, there's so many other options, but it's very pared down just for convenience and drama to like, oh, I gotta decide right now. But then there's one more little twist at the end that I guess I won't spoil, that turns it into quite the cliffhanger, which I thought was hilarious. So I don't know what will happen in season 3. They've certainly set up, I think, a pretty funny premise for the 3rd season, and they've still got this big dilemma cliffhanger. I don't even know if there will be a season 3. I don't think the ratings really got that much better throughout season 2. So if this is how the whole show ends, I gotta say I'm pretty impressed because it's just so bizarre to end a sitcom on this just note of ambiguity and strangeness. So yeah, overall, I was pretty happy with it. I would give it an 8. I think this is just like a very solid, well put together sitcom that is genuinely funny most of the time. I think it's struck a good balance between leaning into some of the crazier aspects of the show while still softening things up so that people could conceivably get attached. Didn't really look like they did, but whatever. I would check it out if you're a fan of kind of NBC sitcoms, Lorne Michaels type stuff. The high school setting is quite unique and might appeal to you if you're big into like high school anime and stuff too, and you want a more insane look at the kind of common storyline beats and tropes and such. Yeah, overall a pretty good time. That's all I have to say about it. Bye bye.